going to be a little different than some other two talks we've done. I'm actually going a bit out of my own comfort zone to talk about this topic, but I think it's actually quite a relevant one, given that volcanoes are very famous, very charismatic disasters that have plagued humanity through history. And as we speak, we're living through our own disaster right now with the COVID pandemic. I think we're finally getting a handle on it, but I think the lessons that we can draw from volcanic disasters apply in other disaster scenarios as well. So that was kind of my motivation for making this talk. And also, I really just wanted to tell lots of cool stories, and there's some really great stories that come out of doing this work, which is part of the reason why I do it. Before I actually get into any element of the talk, I just wanted to, just touch on current events. As we speak, there's an eruption going on at Mount Etna in Sicily. This, so shown here on the map in the upper right. These are actual pictures that were taken just a few days ago. I think this photo on the right was taken on Monday. So this is like, the Earth is alive and it's doing its thing right now. Etna is a very active volcano. It has been for millennia, since ancient Rome, since the island was first colonized by the Greeks, way back in the Bronze Age, basically. And right now, I wanted to show you these pictures also because it'll be a good touchstone for thinking about what an eruption looks like. This is a good example of what's called an effusive eruption, an eruption that's rich in lava flows. And that's what you're seeing here on the left. And on the right, you're seeing, you can almost see where my cursor is. You see a little blob of red. It may not be obvious to you from this angle, but this is actually what's called a fire fountain. This is a curtain of lava. That can be, it could be a few meters high. The tallest ever measured was 1.5 kilometers. So these things can be pretty spooky. And this one over Etna, I think, is somewhere around 50 to 100 meters tall. So would tower over most parts of London, just to give you a sense of scale. All right, so that was just a fun introduction. I myself, I am a geochemist, so I'm very much like a physical scientist by training, and my thesis is not really about disaster risk necessarily. Oh, already got a great question in the chat. I'll file this away and I'll come back to it at the end. But if you have questions throughout, like Isti did, please post them in the chat. I will get to them. That I figured that would, I'm going to share lots of anecdotes and lots of questions are going to come out of them like that. As I was saying, yeah, I'm a physical scientist by training. I'm not like some of the elements I'm going to talk about today are very much rooted in social science research. So in my experience, I haven't used these techniques myself, but I work with people who do. And really the sort of disaster management side of volcanoes is why I got into this field in the first place. I've worked on a number of volcanoes in my time, not as many as I would like, as I was telling Ava at the start of this, because unfortunately COVID. But these are some pictures from, of me or places I've been doing field work or just doing general touristing. I've been out to sea for 2 weeks to study seafloor volcanoes. I've done work in Yellowstone on the Cascade Range. And my thesis topic is on the volcanoes of Java. So that's just a bit about me. And now I want to give you kind of an overview of what we're going to go through today. So I'm going to try to give you a sort of lightning tour, Volcano 101, so you can understand what a volcano is, how it works, and how we describe eruptions, and what are the hazards of those eruptions. You kind of need that baseline to then get into the question of how we manage that risk. So that's going to be the second topic that we're going to go through, risk management strategies. Again, I'm going to touch, it's a very rich field. The UN has an entire office dedicated to disaster risk management that's been active for decades. I mean, there's, thousands of pages of research done on this topic. So I'm going to do a very sort of surface level summary. And then we're going to wrap up by looking at a case study, I think in some ways showing, at least in my opinion, some of the best practices I've seen for disaster risk management. And that's a volcano in Ecuador called Tungurahua. I've been practicing that all day to get that right. So that's how we'll finish today. But all right, to get started, so what is a volcano? That's probably a somewhat insulting slide to throw at you. I'm sure you all feel like you know what a volcano is. And if you gave me your definition right now, I probably would be reasonably correct. But I recognize that some of you may not have thought about a volcano since year 8 geography or something like that, unless you live near a volcano, in which case, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear about what your experience is. But volcanoes are essentially, there are windows into the deep earth. They're places where molten bits of the Earth's crust and mantle concentrate. And they're very rare. Even though I say there's 500 and I'm going to talk about a lot of them, it's going to give you the impression they're everywhere. As we know, we live in a country that within its geographic bounds in Europe has no active volcanoes. And most of Europe, other than Italy and Greece, really have no volcanoes that are active today. So these are quite rare phenomena, but they happen to occur and happen to create environments that are very conducive to human life, as we'll talk about a bit more generally. What I want to emphasize here in red, I've highlighted, if you can see my cursor, I've highlighted the main hazards that we're going to worry about with volcanoes. There's actually a lot of potential ways a volcano can kill you. And I should also pause for a moment and say, if anyone's uncomfortable with the topic of death, I just want to warn you that I am going to talk about fatalities. There are going to be no images of death at all. I purposely did not include any pictures of the actual like fatal events. But if you are uncomfortable with that, I'm just giving you fair warning that we are going to be talking about these things. So hopefully that gets everyone on a comfortable page. Anyway, yeah, the main things we're going to be worrying about. The first thing you probably thought of when you thought of a volcano when you saw this talk advertised was a lava flow. I'm sorry to tell you that lava flows are not what we really worry about when it comes to hazards. There are a few special cases. Obviously, Hawaii is the big charismatic example. Nyiragongo, a volcano in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is another example where we do worry about lava flows in a disaster risk context. But the ones we really worry about are ashfall, pyroclastic flows, and lahars. So taking them in order, ashfall is, as it looks here, is essentially a raining out of ash, which is tiny chips of rock formed during an explosive eruption. Ashfall can be debilitating in many senses. It can disable vehicles, it can shut down engines and electronics, it can collapse roofs, it can cause respiratory damage. There's a lot of reasons we worry about ashfall. Pyroclastic flows and lahars are both density currents that can occur quite suddenly and quite quickly down the slope of a volcano. The difference between the two is a pyroclastic flow is much hotter, driven by gas and big chunks of rock, and can move up to 150 kilometers an hour, can be up to 300-400 degrees Celsius. A lahar is water mediated, so it's essentially a mud flow that's generated by a volcanic eruption. And as we'll talk about, these events can actually happen well after an eruption has occurred, which is what makes them so deadly. So this is why we care about these guys. Lava flows, most of you could outrun, and frankly, you could even probably take a nap in front of one and be safe. In most cases, I still wouldn't recommend that, but that is likely the case. And then kind of the final primer for your Volcano 101, how do volcanoes erupt? This is a very rich research area, as you can imagine. The physics and chemistry that go into understanding this are part of like what I do for my PhD, and people spend their entire lives trying to answer this question, and we still haven't nailed down the answer yet. So, there should be perhaps an asterisk here, but the essential thing to recognize is that volcanoes have distinctive and identifiable eruptive styles. These styles can be quantified, so I'm not even going to get into the eruptive scale we use today. I was going to originally, but put that aside. I'm just sort of qualitatively, we can think about eruptions as being driven by their chemistry, their physical properties, and the geology of the surrounding region. And this produces some really systematic kind of eruption types. So going from left to right here in this diagram, we're going from sort of generally less destructive, less explosive to very explosive and very destructive and potentially fatal. So in sort of the left-hand side, we're thinking mainly about lava flow-driven eruptions. Caldera volcanoes can actually do more. They can explode. So, maybe maybe set that aside. But a Hawaiian-style eruption is going to mainly produce lava flows, minimal explosions, and is generally not going to be a threat to human life in most cases. So what we really are concerned about when we're talking about volcanic risk in the context of today's presentation are stratovolcanoes, are explosive eruptions. And these eruptions are given names, historical names, based on famous localities that have exhibited these styles. So we have Strombolian eruptions. Strombolian eruptions are named after Stromboli, a volcano in Italy. You'll notice Italy dominates a lot of the nomenclature because Italy is where a lot of the historical description of volcanoes in Europe has been done. So strombolian eruptions tend to be quite small, mainly. That's actually what you're seeing at Etna right now is a kind of a strombolian eruption. Bombs, limited pyroclastic flows, lava flows, things like that. As we move to the right, we start getting more and more explosive. Volcanian eruptions are named after Volcano, which is the island in the Mediterranean that gives us the name Volcano. It also corresponds to the Roman name for the god of fire, Vulcan. So, this volcano is quite historically important. Slightly more explosive, a lot more ash, some pyroclastic flows, and lahars as well. Should add, if it's raining, you can easily turn ash into a lahar. And then we move to Pelean and Plinian eruptions. Pelean eruptions, named after the Mount Pelée disaster of 1902. The volcano erupted, huge pyroclastic flow, hurtled downhill, and killed about 30,000 people, unfortunately. This was in French Martinique, which was a colony of France at the time. It was a really devastating event that kind of triggered initial research into volcano science. And then finally, the most explosive, most destructive, and sometimes civilization-ending style eruption is a Plinian eruption. This name comes from Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman writer, intellectual, nephew to the very well-known Pliny the Elder, who's a famous naturalist, one of the first scientists recognized in the Roman world. Pliny the Elder died in the Vesuvius 79 AD eruption, and his nephew Pliny the Younger recorded the events of that eruption as he fled on the Bay of Naples on a boat. So we basically, for his efforts in giving the first modern kind of scientific description of an eruption in 79 AD, we give him the honor of being, having eruptions named after him. So I wanted to introduce these terms to you because I'm going to use them kind of in the talk here. Is everything okay, Ava? I thought I heard you say something. Okay, yeah, I just wanted, okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. I thought in case of technical issues, I just wanted to check. So I'm going to be referring to these, I'm going to be using these qualitative categories to describe eruptions from here on. So that's why I wanted to introduce these to you. And to emphasize as well that these eruptions aren't fixed. It's not like Stromboli only ever does Strombolian style eruptions, confusingly. These aren't like, this isn't like the pandemic. With COVID, we know it's going to remain a respiratory illness, I believe. There maybe is a small likelihood it does something crazy. But, COVID isn't going to suddenly mutate into Ebola. I mean, that's not how it works biologically. But volcanoes can suddenly mutate, go from a Strombolian eruption to a Plinian eruption. They could do that in a matter of days to weeks. And that is fundamentally what makes managing volcanic risk so difficult. Perfect example of this is Montserrat. This is a volcano I've showed on the map up here. Most of you probably don't know where it is, which is a shame because it's a really beautiful island with a really rich history and culture. It's shown here in the Caribbean. It's a British overseas territory, so it's technically part of the UK administratively, politically, though it has control over its own domestic affairs. But in 1995, it sort of experienced this devastating eruption that lasted, you can see, 25 years, a whole generation. This eruption was ongoing. This eruption forced the evacuation of the entire island. All the residents of Montserrat were resettled in the mainland UK. And to this day, most remain here. It's a very interesting story and very tragic story if you're interested in hearing more about it. But what I wanted to show here, emphasizing how dynamic eruptions can be, is the fact that in the span of a few months, from December 1996 to the spring of 1997, the eruption went from a Strombolian, almost Hawaiian-style lava flow eruption to a much more explosive Volcanian phase. And this eruption got up to sort of Pelean-style eruptions as well. So it changed back and forth constantly between eruption styles, and that made managing the risk really difficult. So that was your Volcano 101. It took a bit longer than I hoped, but bear with me. I'm gonna, this next bit won't take too long, hopefully. So what I want to, on that note, I want to talk about risk management now as sort of a concept. So like I said, this is a hugely rich academic field, and I'm very much sort of just skimming the surface here. If any of you know anything about this, I probably could learn from you, frankly, because this is stuff that is, I'm learning about every day myself, essentially. But in the context of volcanoes, the fact that they can occur, the eruptions can occur rapidly. They can essentially, in a matter of days to weeks, they can initiate, sometimes with little to no warning. The hazards can be maintained over long periods of time, even after an eruptive phase has ceased. And the fact that they often encourage human settlement. Some of the largest cities on Earth are located next to volcanoes. Tokyo, Naples, many cities in Indonesia, like Yogyakarta, which is a city I've spent a lot of time in. A lot of these places are threatened by volcanoes. And in the long run, volcanoes can pose a really debilitating and very high risk scenario to any population center, big or small. I sort of give a rural example here. So like ashfall can essentially devastate the livelihood of a farming community in every conceivable way. Infrastructure in terms of their actual crops, their means of transport, their health, their economic livelihood. All of these things can be destroyed in just one sort of eruptive event. So it's very difficult to manage this risk. And there are 4 potential ways we could go about doing this, being very simplistic, 4 strategies we could employ to manage this risk as sort of looking at it from a scientific or a public policy standpoint. All right, so strategy 1, the least exciting strategy, do nothing. So you can probably see some obvious drawbacks here. With volcanoes, you can imagine with some volcanoes, you can't really afford to do nothing. But that being said, for some volcanoes, the likelihood of an eruptive event, we can be reasonably confident is very low. And in those cases, it doesn't really make sense to invest the resources and energy to manage the risk. In some cases, those investments could be counterproductive. I could mention the super volcano Yellowstone, where I've done field work in the United States. If that volcano erupted, it would wipe out human civilization effectively. It would not be a good time to be a human on Earth. But the likelihood of that event occurring is so low that the US government has essentially not prioritized, they're not going to evacuate the entire Rocky Mountain region. It just wouldn't be feasible, and it's not worth the investment. So strategy 1 is applicable in some situations, but obviously not ideal in many of them. All right, so if we want to actually do something, what can we do? Well, the first 2 options that come to mind are fight or flight, right? We can either try to protect ourselves from the eruption, or we can run away from it. And the running away from it is one of the most commonly employed strategies and tried and true in many respects. So these would be evacuations, and we do this for other disasters as well, I should note: floods, droughts, conflicts, sort of like military conflicts, earthquakes. Evacuations are very common in lots of disaster contexts. When done correctly, they can save hundreds of thousands of lives in the context of a volcano. Some good examples are Pinatubo, 1991 in the Philippines, and Agung in Bali, Indonesia in 2018. The government coordinated evacuations, moved hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of days to weeks, and essentially resulted in minimal fatalities. Only you could count sort of on 2 hands how many people died in those eruptions. So pretty remarkable if you look at it just from a fatality standpoint. But evacuations have really big costs that kind of go beyond just the fatality statistics. The actual initiation of an evacuation and its success in any case is dependent on the cultural and economic conditions in the region. You can imagine in conflict-prone places, people aren't going to want to leave their homes. They may not trust the people telling them to leave their homes if there's not a lot of government trust. The evacuation itself can also promote lots of really bad public health outcomes. You essentially are creating a mass refugee situation where there was a stable community beforehand. And as we know from other research into refugee settlements from human conflicts, there are lots of problems in terms of social antagonism that can develop in those ways. And finally, evacuations are no easy feat. The case study I'm going to talk about, Tungurahua in Ecuador, they evacuated 25,000 people in a few days. That's pretty remarkable. But if you imagine trying to evacuate the entire city of Naples, if you've ever been to Naples and you've driven on the roads there, which me and my wife have, imagining a metropolitan area like that evacuating en masse is unthinkable. It just wouldn't be workable in many ways. So strategy 2 can't always work. That's the sort of bottom line. And it's not always the ideal outcome that you want. All right, so we tried flight. What about fight? And this would be some sort of engineered solution. Now, I'm just going to say front page, another thing to take away from this talk. We can't stop eruptions. There is no way. The Star Trek universe that imagines we can just put force fields around volcanoes, that just wouldn't work. That's not how the Earth works, unfortunately, as much as I love Star Trek. So, engineered solutions often aren't feasible. there are cases where they can work. A good example of this is a volcano I'm hoping to study one day. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go this year, but it's a volcano called Kelut. It's in East Java in Indonesia, marked up on the map over here. And this is a picture of its eruption in 2014. So Kelut is unique in that it's one of a handful of volcanoes that has a crater lake, a big water body at the top. And when it erupts, it produces huge lahars, absolutely devastating lahars. And in 1919, its eruption killed about 2,000 people. This prompted the only known successful volcano lake draining in the world. This has been an ongoing engineering effort since 1919. People hand dug out the tunnel and stabilized the tunnel to drain out the lake. And this has remained successful, keeping the lake level low, keeping lahar activity low. So you might say, wow, why can't we do this everywhere? Well, first of all, volcano crater lakes, not very common. There are a handful of volcanoes like this. We thought about doing this in other places as well. The engineering solution itself is actually quite challenging. You can imagine a tectonically active volcano with earthquakes and eruptions. It's, the tunnel does collapse as it did at Kelut in 1951. So, it's a very investment heavy strategy if that's what you're going to do. Some engineered solutions just aren't going to work. You can't really stop the volcano from blowing its entire top off, which some do in like a Plinian eruption. And the final downside, I think the biggest downside that may not be obvious at first glance is a concept in disaster management called risk transference. And this is the idea that when you use engineered solutions exclusively and you neglect other aspects of a holistic disaster risk management strategy, you give a false sense of security to people. You tell them we've managed to, lower the risk, you're safe now. People let their guard down. And for instance, in some really well-known examples, especially in like flood zones in like the Mississippi, people will build precarious developments because they think, oh, it's safe now. We have a new levee, or we have some new engineered solution to the disaster that always plagued our community. And what that does is essentially increase the risk in the long term. Because in the long term, there is going to be a 1 in 1,000 year, freak event that is going to overrun the banks, or in this case, could blow off the side of Kelut. In which case, then your engineered solution has actually created more problems in the long term than the short-term gains that you got from the initial solution. So strategy 3, again, not terrible on its own, but it can't happen in isolation. All right, so that might sound like we've exhausted all options there. But there's one left, and that's the title of this talk, Living with Volcanoes. And this is given the sort of approach I'm going to talk about with this, is coined the sustainable livelihood model, which views living with risk as, I'm just quoting here from a paper I really like on this, living with risk means creating and maintaining habitats and livelihoods by using available resources without destroying those resources. That actually has a lot of influence from sustainability, sort of environmental sustainability, the way this definition is crafted. But if you replace resource with volcano here, or volcanic resources, then you kind of see the application. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about strategy 4 on this slide, because I'm basically going to give you a case study, full example at this Tungurahua, I always struggle saying that volcano's name, at this case study I'm going to talk about in a moment. But one of the key findings from research in this area is that if you want to reduce disaster risk, the best thing you can do is maintain a sense of how important people's livelihoods are when you're asking them to do things like evacuate or sell their land or change their lifestyle. You need to kind of be empathetic to the fact that people care about where they're from. The volcano exists in a social, cultural context, and you can't divorce the two from each other. And volcanoes also have benefits. Many volcanoes today are huge tourist revenue sources for many communities. In some cases, they can be the main source of income in that regard. And volcanoes, since the dawn of human civilization, have been obvious sites to set up beautiful, fertile farms. It's where most of our coffee comes from. Fun fact is sort of volcanic generated soil. So, these aren't inherently, volcanoes aren't inherently bad necessarily for many reasons. So I'm going to advocate strategy 4. That's going to be the rest of the talk. And I recognize I've already gone I'm going to go a little over. I hope that's okay, Ava, just to give this case study. But in this case study, I'll demonstrate what sustainable livelihood models mean in sort of context. with one of the best examples I know. All right, so so on this slide, I actually put the pronunciation so I remembered how to say it. So the volcano I'm going to talk about is Tungurahua. This is one of many volcanoes in Ecuador in the Andes in South America. You see sort of a chain of them here defining sort of the backbone of the country. The capital of Quito is up here next to the volcano Pichincha and Cayambe. Tungurahua has been settled for a long period of time, primarily by indigenous communities, but also by Spanish communities since the arrival of Spanish settlers. As many volcanoes are in the Andes, it's usually covered by ice in the winter. It's at 5,000 meter elevation, so quite a hike to get up there. Just sort of sketching out the setting here, because we're going to talk about it for a couple minutes, is it's not heavily populated. It's not like volcanoes in Tokyo or Seattle, where you have huge population centers nearby. Population around there is maybe around 30,000 in total around the whole of the volcano. Most of the communities live in isolated agricultural villages called faldas, and the largest city named Banos has a population of about 10,000. We'll talk a lot more about Banos in a moment. This volcano has been active in historic time, probably was active long before that, before we had written Spanish records. But the eruption we're going to focus on is 1999, which has essentially kicked off a period of activity that has been intermittently on and off since the late 90s. So this is sort of where we're going, and this is the story I'm going to tell. All right, so this is a picture from Tungurahua. Not a very pretty sight. If you imagine, you can see why volcanoes are often tied to religious and cultural traditions, because this is a pretty scary thing to see, right? So the eruption that sort of started this all off was in September 1999. There were steam and gas emissions visible from the volcano. Scientific and government administrators got involved at the reports of this from the community. And by the 11th of October, so just over a month after we had any indication that this volcano was awake, there were the first Vulcanian Strombolian eruptions. So that's what you're seeing here. Essentially, you're seeing Strombolian eruptions. But remember, once we kind of kick up to a Vulcanian level, we're talking pyroclastic flows, lahars, things that can be really damaging and really deadly, can kill tens of thousands of people. So on the 16th of October, the president of Ecuador ordered an evacuation. As I mentioned just a moment ago, this evacuation was successful initially. 26,000 people evacuated in just a few days. And this very mountainous terrain. It's not like there's a superhighway nearby to get people out. This was remarkable that the military was essentially able to go in and get everyone out in that amount of time. And this first phase of eruption continued from October 1999 through to December. And then there was a bit of a quiescent period in 2000. So all in all, that might be a nice story on its own. But as I said, volcanoes do not exist independent of humans. There's always a social and political context. And that's where this eruption really gets interesting. So 1999 was not a great year for Ecuador, unfortunately. As the volcano was waking up, Ecuador was being hit with sort of three crises, political and economic in nature. Just after the eruption in the year 2000, there was a coup attempt, so a big political turmoil. And in 1999, there was sort of the stirrings of this political conflict already sort of racking the country. The World Bank was in confrontation with the Ecuadorian government at this moment. Apparently, there was some dispute over loans, and the World Bank wanted the Ecuadorian government to cut state aid to local communities in order to meet its loan conditions. So it was a big international financial conflict. And simultaneously, the Ecuadorian government had decided it was going to pin its currency to the US dollar, and that caused huge inflation problems. I'm not an economist, so I can't really explain a lot of these in detail, but people were already politically and economically incredibly anxious. They knew their country was not in a great state at the moment, and then this volcano kicked off. So people were told to leave their homes, leave everything they ever knew, their houses, their livestock, all that kind of defined their lives, leave it behind, and also at the same time sort of abandon their means of making money in many degrees. So while this was done by the military was essentially pulling them all out, evacuating them. And this unrest, so this led to tension. People were not happy that the way the military got involved. as often happens in these situations. And reports started circulating at the end of 1999 that soldiers were actually looting homes and taking property while they were sitting idle, waiting for the volcano to erupt. This unrest boiled over January 6, 2000, I almost said 2020. And some residents from Banos, the major population center, overwhelmed the barricades, the military barricades, and like in a big mass march, returned to town and reoccupied it. Within a year, all the Faldas, Banos, all the major population centers were reoccupied. And that was sort of that. The eruption was not done. It sort of quieted down a bit, but scientists knew there were still earthquakes, there were still gas emissions. So this volcano was not finished by any means, and people had returned. So obviously you can see there's some problems here that need to be addressed from a risk management standpoint. And another little tidbit I want to mention is that while the unrest was ratcheting up just before the mass march to Banos occurred, a group of community members formed a sort of informal network called Los Ojos del Volcán. And this is called the Eyes of the Volcano, if you know Spanish. And this was a community group that was organized to monitor and watch the volcano and report to the evacuees. Because with this tension developing with the authorities, the community didn't trust the information they were getting anymore, which is understandable, especially if you think that the people in charge are taking advantage of you financially. It would be understandable that you'd like to trust your own eyes on the volcano you've lived on your entire life, rather than some university educated scientist who just showed up yesterday. So you can see the tensions here, social, political, that sort of lead to these types of problems. And this, I should add, this is a really interesting story, I think, human story, but this happens at volcanoes all over the world and also in non-volcanic contexts. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. So after the eruption, that phase of the eruption ends, the government declares success. We had no fatalities, we got everyone out, job well done, mission accomplished. But the evacuees had a very different perspective. They were really anxious about loss of property, loss of livelihood, both social, economic, cultural. There were also unequal health outcomes, unfortunately, in some of the resettlement camps or albergues. There was a rise in domestic abuse. Respiratory illness from the ashfall was increased twofold over 1990s average. So there were some really serious impacts that were devastating the community, essentially. And you have to imagine as well, lots of people lost their property from lahars and pyroclastic flows. And some farmers in the exclusion zone for the hazard zone were forced by the military, essentially at gunpoint, to sell their land because the military didn't want them returning and putting themselves in danger. So many people were left homeless, without jobs. It was not an ideal situation. So that's the sort of setup there. And that's where we come to sort of the culmination of all of this. And that's this community-driven volunteer network that developed in the recovery phase that to this day is sort of, to me, is sort of like a model for this kind of sustainable livelihoods approach to volcano risk management. So this is this volunteer network is called the Viejas, which I think in Spanish it loosely translates to like sentinel or watch, watchman or something like that. So the Viejas network was sort of informally created. The military and the scientists recognized that they had made some mistakes. The fact that, a mass movement overran military barricades, usually that means that you messed something up along the way. And so the military took a very sort of technocratic approach. They said, well, let's get boots on the ground. Let's have people in the communities that can work with us, that we can trust and they can trust us, be our ears on the ground and also our eyes on the ground, helping to communicate disaster information. So this is where this Viejas network sort of started, was this sort of military-led, essentially communication role. And it was something that the community members wanted as well. Remember those Los Ojos del Volcán, the community group that was observing the volcano. The community wanted information. They wanted to be part of the decision-making process. And so all the stakeholders kind of simultaneously, very organically realized, like, yeah, we could all work together on this to make sure future evacuations are more successful if they're needed. This was initially, it was very ad hoc. They were just kind of reaching out to people saying, do you want to be involved? Do you know someone who'd like to be involved? And the initial roles of the Viejas were to facilitate communication and share observations. This very quickly evolved beyond anything anyone could imagine. So within the first few months, I believe, a local fireman decided that they needed a quicker way to communicate because they were doing essentially mouth-to-mouth communication, running from village to village to communicate across the volcano. So he, with the help of some other viejas, led this effort to install radios all over the volcano that connected with the scientists. The scientists then saw an opportunity to not only build trust and relationships, but then get more information. And the viejas sort of started this daily routine that continues to this day of reporting into the volcano observatory every night at 8 p.m. Every viejas is expected to give observations, any sort of worry they have about the volcano, and the scientists and civil defense authorities distribute information. So this all emerged quite organically. There wasn't really a framework in place for this, but it very quickly showed itself to be an incredibly successful model. Especially because right after the Viejas network was started, the Civil Defense Authority was essentially completely reformed and overhauled. And the civil defense, the military said, we're out, we're not involved anymore. And it was just the scientists and the volunteers in the community that were keeping this network alive. So the numbers of Viejas, they varied a bit, gone from 35 to 50 at a peak in 2006. And the viejas often tend to be community leaders, or it's kind of a very desirable role in that respect. It's a very public role to be seen in. But the viejas, they went well beyond just communicating generally, and have started to diversify. They take on roles like repairing monitoring equipment that scientists deploy and can't get to. They've actually taken on administrative roles like organizing rotas for who's watching which day, trainings and stuff like that. They've also taken on other disaster response roles, monitoring wildfires, earthquakes, droughts, things like that. So the viejas have sort of, what started as an initial sort of volcano essentially communicator role, quickly became sort of like a community disaster czar, as it were. And in many instances, there are many instances that have been attributed specifically, viejas have actually intervened individually with their training from the scientists and with their ability to communicate with others in the community, have intervened directly to save lives. With the training they've received, they know what to look for with signs of a lahar. They know how much time they have to evacuate, thanks to their collaboration with the scientists. And there's a few, I think it's Juivi Chico, this village here, was actually evacuated in 2006 from a lahar that was coming downhill in time to save everyone. So this was an incredibly robust network that continues to operate to this day, all sort of organized ad hoc post Banos sort of rebellion, essentially. So it's a great story. Why does it work? Like, what lessons can we draw from this? As a scientist, what I draw from this is that the regular sort of communication, the trust, the shared values, and the willingness of the scientists to engage with the community on their own terms is what really has made this program a success. It's easy for scientists to think that they know what's going on at something they've studied their whole life. But when you think about it, as this quote from a community member sums up, viejas are the ones, they're living in the community, and their ancestors, probably going back countless years and centuries, have lived in this one spot in many cases. So they know this volcano better than anyone in many respects. Just because we show up with some seismometers or we start doing some fancy chemistry in the volcano doesn't mean necessarily that we as scientists know any better. And so the scientists took that sort of humble approach, and they live their daily lives within the community. They celebrate with them. They have weddings and funerals together. And that shared bond really sort of has made this a two-way street where the viejas feel like they're on an equal footing with their scientific colleagues, and has allowed this network to continue to sort of prosper. So I love this area of research. I actually got to one of the UK scientists who's been involved with the network. I saw him give a talk on this a few years ago, and what it was like, working with the viejas, interviewing them and living in the communities and the faldas with them. And it's just I think it's an outstanding example of what happens when citizen science is engaged with seriously in a disaster risk standpoint. Because that's essentially what this is a citizen science project. So one of the keys, though, the thing that makes this most successful, that all the studies I've read have pointed to, the fact that the eruption is still continuing, the volcano is still active, is what allows this network to persevere. if you imagine if the volcano suddenly just stops, no more activity, no more earthquakes, there's not a lot of motivation for the viejas to sacrifice their valuable time that they're not getting paid for. They're volunteers, remember. They, if the volcano's quiet, there's no real incentive to keep doing these tasks. So the key here, if you want this, my big takeaway is that if you want this to be an applicable model in other disaster scenarios, you need a disaster to be ongoing, which presents problems for thinking about how you plan this, because you can't really like plan, you have to really organize it quite quickly. So you essentially have to have protocols in place ready to go to set up this bottom-up kind of approach. So all sounds good, but just to end on a slightly ominous note to make sure you understand how important this network is. This paper was just published last year by a group mainly based at the University of Bristol. And what the sort of headline news from this paper showed was that the west side of the volcano is currently inflating about 3 centimeters. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that presages potentially a much larger possibly Palaean style eruption with big pyroclastic flows. So the event, the Tungurahua's sort of life cycle is not over yet, and the vigilance of the viejas is needed now more than ever. So this is a picture of Tungurahua recently. I think it's a perfect image to end on. So thank you.